Okay, so now we move into our gospel passage, which I've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again. A lot of times, at least for ordinary time, the first reading and the gospel passage match up really well, or at least there is a really good connection between them. And then the second reading is kind of its own thing. It's going on its own 3-year cycle. So that's usually how it is in ordinary time. In the special seasons, the readings sometimes match up really well, sometimes don't match up really well. I think during Lent, the first reading is the one that kind of goes off on its own tangent, and the gospel passage, so there's less intentional connection between the first reading, the second, and the gospel reading. However, during Advent, there still is a connection, and as I mentioned, or as we talked about in our first reading, our first reading is all about this sense of acknowledging our sinfulness and realizing our need for God to do something, our need for God to turn our attention toward Him. That's the real thing that's going on in this first reading, this longing for the Lord. Okay, so now our gospel passage comes from what? It comes not from the beginning of the gospel, it comes from the end of the gospel. And now, because we're in a new liturgical year, we're in year B, that means our gospel primarily is going to come from the Gospel of Mark. We're going to hear from a couple of other places in the coming weeks, because Mark doesn't actually have an infancy narrative. He doesn't have the angel appearing to anybody, Mary or Joseph. He doesn't have any sort of birth narrative. He just kind of gets right down to it when he's talking about the gospel of what Jesus has done, what God has done in the person of Jesus. So because of that, we have to refer to the Gospel of Luke, and I think we'll look at maybe the Gospel of John a little bit. And then Mark, on top of that, is also the shortest of the 4 Gospels. And so because of that, we actually take a big break in the middle of our liturgical year during the summer, and during ordinary time, and we'll read for 5 weeks in a row from the Gospel of John. I'm getting way ahead of myself here. I'm way ahead of myself. So we're still in the first week of Advent in year B. So we're jumping into Mark chapter 13, verses 33 through 37. Let's read it. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be watchful, be alert. You do not know when the time will come. It is like a man traveling abroad. He leaves home and places his servants in charge, each with his own work, and orders the gatekeeper to be on the watch. Watch therefore, you do not know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or in the morning. May he not come suddenly and find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to all, watch." Okay, this is, again, another reminder for us, just like our first reading was a big reminder for us that Advent is not only about the warm, fuzzy feeling we get when we talk about the birth of Jesus, God becoming man, and we look into the stable and we see this little baby, and the animals around them and the shepherds coming, the angels singing, that's really nice. And we'll certainly get to that in Advent, but we begin by talking about the second advent of Christ, which is ultimately the second coming of Christ. The parousia, and we'll talk more about that in our next video when we look at the second reading. But anyway, so that's ultimately what we're talking about, the parousia, or in Latin, the adventus, which is the second coming of Christ, when he's going to come. And so he uses this image to share, and he's actually within the entire chapter of chapter 13 in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is laying out for his disciples this reality, this teaching. And this, I think, is a fascinating thing, because again, I've probably said this a bunch of times, but we in the church today don't talk much about the second coming, and at the second coming, how there's a judgment that is to come. When Jesus talks about how we need to be alert, how we need to be watchful, what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is so that the master of the house, the Lord of the house, doesn't find us sleeping. This implies a judgment, because if the Lord of the house comes when he finds us sleeping, well, Jesus says, oh no, may that not happen. If the servant is sleeping, when the master has told the servant to be prepared, then there's going to be a judgment that comes from that. He's going to be fired from his job. He's going to lose his task. And when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about an unfavorable judgment, ultimately, when he comes again. So we don't talk much about this. And so because we don't talk much about this, when we recognize it, we should talk a lot about it, so that we can try to redirect our mind and our attention toward this reality that is to come. So this is something we believe. This is something that the Christian church has always believed. Why have we always believed it? Because Jesus himself spoke about it. And then, of course, we know that St. Paul later on talks about it when he talks about the second coming of Christ. In the Old Testament, they talk about it as though it's the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the day of judgment, when the Lord is going to come. And, of course, the day of the Lord comes in a real sense when Jesus comes the first time. But there is a second day of the Lord coming, an ultimate day of the Lord coming, when the living and the dead will be judged according to their deeds. This is so big. So Jesus here is giving a bit of a warning where he's talking about, okay, you need to be ready for this. Be watchful. Be alert. What does that mean? It means we got to be on the lookout. Vigilance. This real sense, right? So there's another image that Jesus talks about in the Gospels. He says, if the master of the house knew the hour when his house was going to be broken into, he would not have gone to sleep. He would have been waiting for that person. The thing is that we don't know, and this is something that's clear, and also that's a little bit frustrating about the Gospels, is that Jesus talks about this second adventus, the second coming, but he says, you don't know when it's going to come, and I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you. In fact, even in his humanity, his limited humanity, he himself, the Son of Man, doesn't even know when that time is going to come. And so in a very real way, Jesus calls us to this vigilance and to be vigilant always, which brings a number of consequences. One of them is that being vigilant can be difficult. It can be trying, actually. And yet the Lord calls us to do this. And we're going to see this in our second reading, where St. Paul talks about how the Lord calls us to this vigilance, but he also equips us so that as we wait, as we hold vigilance, we can also maintain our energy, our level of energy, as we wait in vigilance for him. The second thing is what? What is the second thing? The second thing is because we don't know, we just, like, part of always being ready means this sense of living virtuously, of living as though the coming could come at any moment. So I think a lot of us can have this mentality of like, well, it's been 2,000 years, and so I can let off on the gas pedal a little bit because he's probably not going to come during my life, and so I'll just wait until I'm on my deathbed. But the reality is no, like, he could actually come during our lives, and for that matter, even if he doesn't come during our lives, any of us could have a massive heart attack at any moment. Any of us could be hit by a car at any moment. Tragedy strikes people at any given time. And the thing is that if we know when it's going to happen, or if we think that it's not going to happen and so we can just wait, well, then our tendency is to say, well, I'll just wait until that moment because I know exactly when it's going to come. And so that's part of the reason that the Lord doesn't tell us when it's going to happen, because we have to always be ready, as though it could happen right now. Or 10 minutes from now, or whatever, like to be prepared. So that's why he talks about being watchful, being alert. This is the thing, actually. So it says, a man traveling abroad, he leaves home and places his servants in charge, each with his own work. And of course we know this, that Jesus, he establishes his church, and his church has ministers and leaders. And so he places them in charge, but in charge of what? The household. We who are members of the household, we need to allow ourselves to be a part of this waiting, of getting things ready. So when the ministers of the church call us to task to be prepared, we need to kind of jump to attention. Now, as church leaders, this is kind of the tricky thing here. Is like I'm leading this Bible study, and so in a sense I'm a church. Well, in a very real way, I'm a priest, so I am a church leader. But at the same time, there are church leaders who are above me, and so it's like I'm kind of in this kind of strange thing where I'm a member of the household, but I'm also among those who in some ways have been placed in charge of, like my parishes, for example. So there's a little bit of a strange thing here. But then as leaders of the church, if we're not calling people to vigilance, then we're going to be judged in a very real way. This is the thing. To be placed in charge of the Lord's house is a great responsibility, a grave responsibility. And so if we as leaders of the church lack in that, or lack in zeal in that, then the Lord sees that. This is the thing, that he is away on a journey, but he also is still with us, and so he sees us going on. So anyway, so when a person would go on a journey back then, now we have our phones, we have GPS, we can email, or we can check itineraries and flight schedules and all that stuff. They didn't have any of that back then. So when a person went on a journey, especially if it was supposed to be a long journey, they didn't necessarily know that, like when they were going to come back, because sometimes people might get held up not in traffic, but in like an ocean storm, that kind of thing, and terrible weather. Weather affected so many things back then. So because of that is like, okay, well, my master is leaving. He thinks that he knows when he's going to be back, and I think I can, based on the distance, all that stuff, I can figure it out. But in a very real way, like, he might be delayed. Or, in fact, an expected delay may not have been a delay. They might have caught good weather, and he could return earlier than is expected. That kind of a sense of, it's like, I really don't know. Like, once my master leaves, I really don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes people, when they go, they might catch sick all of a sudden, and so they might not come back. But the thing is that Jesus tells us the only sure thing is that it's going to happen. So there is no sense of like him leaving and getting sick and not making it back. He tells us that it's going to happen. He just says you don't know when it's going to be. And so the reality is that we are waiting for something that is really going to happen. It's not like this sort of imaginary thing of like, oh, we got to be prepared because, like it's just the best thing to do. No, it's like we got to be prepared because he is going to come back, and we want to be prepared for him when he comes back. And he could come back at any time, whether in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or in the morning. Notice he doesn't say like during the daytime. I think this is a fascinating thing. He doesn't say during the daytime because what? During the daytime, well, everyone's awake. Everyone's awake, unless you're taking a nap, I guess. But even then, a nap is like a temporary thing. Everyone is awake during the daytime. So he's implying that it's going to be at an unexpected time. And he says this in other places in the Gospels, where it's going to be at an unexpected time, at an unknown hour. And so we need to be ready so that when he comes, it doesn't seem sudden, but instead when he comes, we can be like, oh yes, there he is. We've been waiting for him. Let's go out and meet him and be grateful for his coming. So anyway, the Lord calls us to vigilance, and that vigilance is going to include this actually like a desire to see him, because the more I'm vigilant, the more I'm going to be looking forward to his coming. And so the more I'll be saying, like we said in our psalm, Lord, make us turn to you. Let us see your face. Let us see your face, and we shall be saved. This really beautiful thing. It's just like, Lord, you got to come. You got to come, because we're waiting and we're looking and we're watching for you. We're alert, trying to be alert. It's hard. The world we live in doesn't really encourage alertness, doesn't really encourage wakefulness, but instead it encourages sleepiness and drowsiness and drunkenness even. And so, like, Lord, I'm holding out for you. I'm holding out, but you gotta come. You gotta come. Okay, God bless you. We'll see you for the next video.